Hello friends and welcome. I'm Sarah Liz and I have a super fun card project for you today. It is a card for your slider pie and it just makes me laugh so much. So here's our card. We have a little pumpkin pie and it's got tons of dimension and you pull it out. It says pie, love you. It's got whipped cream on the top. I've got lots of tips for you for using this Oh My Pie die set that goes with the circle shape card. We're just going to use it differently. So I used these two squiggly pieces to cut my background of my pie, my pumpkin, and then I nested them together to cut 4 frames. I also put a little mark in one particular spot to help me line everything up later. So I'm bringing in just a little bit of brown ink, very, very lightly, just to make it look like that pumpkin has been in the oven. And then I'll do the same on the crust of the pie. This is just a cream cardstock, so I want it to look like maybe this could have been in the oven. I'm going to stack this up to create a dimensional crust around my pie. But I need to stack up a lot of layers, so I am looking for this deep M in the crust. Carrie Rhodes in her video shows you a different spot that works well for her. Pick one, right? Mark it on your dies so that if you're trying to line up your dies, that gets a little easier. And then when you cut them out, make a little mark on the back of the die cuts to mark that same spot. I thought I could just eyeball this, and I could, but I kept moving things and then I'd have to find that spot again. So it will simplify things for you if you just mark your die cuts as you're cutting them out. I stacked this 4 deep because there are 2 tops in this die set. There's a lattice top and there's like a pierced crust top. Without one of those, I was afraid this would look a little flat, and so this is how I'm going to step it up and make it look like a really special paper pie. I have temporarily adhered my pumpkin to my base, and you can see the dimension on that crust and how that really just elevates an otherwise simple design. This is the Lots of Dots stencil pack. There are 4 6x9 stencils. They're huge, and I'm going to grab this half-tone stencil and turn it sideways. My background is 3.5 by 4 3/4, and I'm just going to do a little bit of light ink blending about halfway down. Just so you know how much I love teal, I didn't even need to grab my ink pad. This brush was fully loaded, and it's just a light wash of color, just a little extra something. Now we can start working on our interactive pie. I am cutting towards the middle. I put that sticker there just to help me remember where I'm headed. And I'm being really careful. I don't want to overshoot the point where they meet and then I've got an extra cut in my pie. I don't want to accidentally tear this corner out. So I am coming in with my little snips and just kind of chipping away at that to make sure I get a really nice join when you're sort of putting the slice in and pulling it back out. I want to stamp Pie Love You, so it will be inside the pie, and when you pull that piece of pie out, it is revealed a little secret message in there. You could do this and just do the card kind of like we have it now and put the slice of pie glued flat to the card. You do not need to do the interactive mechanism, and you could still do something really cute here. I laid the big pie on top just to get my placement, and I'm going to stamp this twice in a crisp black ink, and then I'm going to set that aside. I know I'm hand delivering this card, so I'm going to add a bunch of dimension to my pie to make it look even more real. You could do this for a key lime pie, a chocolate pie. I just think it's a really fun surprise to add to your project. So I'm using 3mm foam tape. It's thicker than normal, but not quite double thick. And I am lining the sides of our slice of pie, and I'm coming right up to the edge. I'm going to use my alcohol markers to color that in and make it look like that foam tape is actually pie. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on the crust, but that bottom crust, I'm going to trim off the squiggles. You think about a pie, the very top of it has the squiggly crust, but then as you go down to the bottom, it's just round because it came out of the tin. So I trimmed off the least possible amount of that pie. And then I will just add the foam tape right around that curve and I will trim that off. I went through my markers and was kind of checking colors to figure out which one I wanted. It's worth noting alcohol markers tend to look different on foam than they do on paper. I'll show you my colors here in just a second. But I'm coloring along the 2 edges of that piece of pie. And then I'm going to use my lighter sort of beige color around the base of the pie. Is anyone looking under the squiggly top crust? I don't know, maybe. And if they do, mine is colored in. So I'm removing the backing from that foam tape, and I'm going to add just a little bit of glue to give myself some wiggle room. And I'm adding this onto my slice of pie. I'm using my fingers just to get everything lined up perfectly right at the tip of it. And you got, I am just, I'm so pleased with how this turned out. For the rest of my pie, I'm kind of doing the same thing. So I've temporarily adhered it where it needs to go on that card base. And then I'm going to trim off the edges so I have a nice clean cut. Then I'll take my scissors and remove just the barest little bit of that squiggle. That deep groove is kind of a wonky one. So I did bring in the slice of pie just to try to make sure I was lining up the edge of that pretty well. But a lot of it gets hidden by the top crust, so it's not that big a deal. On my large pumpkin piece, I have lined right along the edges of where the slice comes out. These are the only two places where I am coloring things orange, on the actual slice of pie and where the slice comes out. For the base of my pie, I have foam tape along the circle edge, and I will color that with my marker to make it look like the pie. But on that right corner, right where we've trimmed off the pie, I'm going to leave that white. That's just the card. That's not pie. Otherwise, the appropriate color, I think, would be orange, right? That's the filling showing, and I thought that was weird. So I've got foam tape kind of in the middle on my orange piece, all along the edges of my beige piece, except where the slice comes out. And I'm going to add a little bit of wet glue to give myself some wiggle room. I want those corners lined up perfectly. I want the edges of the slice lined up perfectly. And actually, that sounds more complicated than it is. I would say I put wet glue along the circle curve. Don't do that. I wasn't putting anything on top of it yet. And so I have wet glue just kind of hanging out, and I almost got glue in places that would have been really noticeable. Then I'm lining up the crust of my pie, and I brought in my slice because I cut off all the squiggles. So that got a little tricky for a second. This is where marking it on the back would be really helpful. And then I'm going to bring in my scissors and very carefully trim the crust where the slice is. I don't want to lose or damage any parts of the crust that are going to be showing on my card. And so you can see I'm kind of flipping and turning that pie to make sure I get a good angle. And that really helps everything to look nice and crisp and clean in the end. Off camera, I trimmed off the pieces of crust that aren't going to be on the card. And then I removed the backing paper from my little slice of pie, and I can add my final squiggle on there. They fit in just like puzzle pieces, right? When they're in the right spot, you definitely know it. And there's my pie. I wanted a little bit of navy behind this panel to make it pop. It's 3 5/8 by 4 7/8, and I cut the middle out with my modern embossed A2 rectangles. We're putting a mechanism, a slider mechanism back there, and I didn't want to have to cut through this panel and a panel of navy cardstock. So it's both saving me some cardstock and gonna help simplify things a little bit later. I put glue around the edges of my panel and then just centered that onto my little frame. And that gives me that pop of color. There's going to be teal behind that as well. And I love the extra darkness in there. To make our slider, I've lined up my slice of pie where I want it when it's fully pulled out. And I'm holding my pencil over the end of the pie and just making a pencil mark on the background. Then I will put the slice back into the pie to make my next mark. I want to make sure the entire hole is covered by this slice of pie, but I want quite a bit of room. So I'm going to put it right at the edge, just hover my pencil over it, make my dot once I pull it out, and then double check, make sure both of those are covered by my slice of pie. I'm using my ruler and a craft knife, but you could certainly use like a sliding blade trimmer if you're more comfortable with that. And I am just carefully making a cut that connects the two dots. Then I move my ruler ever so slightly and I'll make another slice. There's this tiny little gap here, right? This is less than 1/8 of an inch, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, maybe a little less. And I am just gonna pull that extra paper out. It's totally cut along the lines. I just didn't quite cut all the way through the pieces on either end, but that's it. It does not need to be pretty, my friends. No one's gonna see it. The first one I did as a prototype just to make sure it would work, I didn't even use a ruler. I just like cut a hole. You could stick your scissors in there. It's not a big deal, okay? No one's gonna see it. I glued down my slice of pie and it meets right up with the edge of our white panel. To make this slide, I have a scrap of cardstock, mine's a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to create 2 little score lines, right? I'm not even really measuring here. I just know I need 2 score lines. And this first one is going to be 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch, and there's a score line at 1/4 inch. And then I'm going to cut the other one to make it match that. These are too big. I know they're too big, but this is a great place to start. Your cut lines might not match mine exactly. So here's how you figure it out. I am putting removable adhesive on just half. I'm sticking the half that doesn't have adhesive through that slot, right? And I'll just wrap it around. I'm going to do the same thing with the other one. It creates kind of an X fitting through that slot. I'm pushing them all the way in towards the pie. That's where we want it. And then we'll put the slice on top, fitting all the way in there. And I can test this. I'm going to pull my slice back and it's not quite far enough, right? I can't read my sentiment. So I'm going to take that off and I'm going to cut these in half. In the end, mine ended up being a 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch, scored at 1/4 inch. Okay, so I have these 2 little pieces. I'm going to fit them through just like I did before. They sort of line up right next to each other, pushed all the way in towards the pie. Just these 2 little pieces. It still has removable adhesive on it. I'm testing it. I'm going to press that down on top, and when I pull back, it's perfect. Okay, so if you cut your slider mechanism smaller, you get more movement. If it's bigger, you'll get less movement. Okay, and so you can adjust how far things are going to move that way. I used my finger just to get the removable adhesive off of there, and then I'm going to add 2 dots of wet glue. I'm tapping off any excess. If that glue oozes out, I will glue that slice of pie to my white panel and then it won't move, right? So I'm being really careful with that. Then I have flipped everything over and I'm just drawing pencil lines to show you. We need to make sure that the pull tab is going at the same angle as the slice that we made. I have 2 scraps of 100-pound blue cardstock. I doubled this up. This is a movement mechanism. I know kids are going to be playing with mine. I just like it to be really sturdy. So I doubled that up and then I will add this to the back of the mechanism the same way we did to the front. 2 little dots of glue. I'm going to remove any excess with my finger, and you can't see it because I edited it out, but I let that sit for about a minute and get really tacky before I put this on there. I want that to grab on right away. So then I can flip it over and test my mechanism, make sure that nothing is glued shut where it shouldn't be. I'm taking the word pull from the Papercrafting Magic Stamp Set and I'm lining that on the edge of my blue piece. With the slice in, I have my background panel just sitting behind it. I want to make sure that when I trim this shorter, the pull is still going to be there. And then I'm also grabbing an arrow to make sure people know what direction to pull. The angle of the tab really helps with that too. I have taped that sliding mechanism to my MISTI to make sure it doesn't move. And then I am actually pressing down pretty firmly on the pie while I stamp these 2 things because the pie is really thick. And I didn't think about that before I put it in my MISTI. So just something to be aware of. I could have removed my foam pad as well, and that might have helped. This is the Hap-Pie Day Stamp Set, and I love it so much. So we're going to stamp Hap-Pie and Thanksgiving and some VersaMark ink, and then I'm adding some gold embossing powder, and we will heat set that. It's going to be beautiful and shiny, and when I cut this out with the coordinating dies, it has just this tiny sliver of blue around it. It matches the trim on my card, and I absolutely love that. I have so much dimension on this card that I wanted to stack this up. I just had an extra pair sitting around anyway, so I'm going to glue them together and make them a little bit more substantial. The pie is really heavy down in the bottom left, and so I'm going to put these towards the top right. But I do need to make sure that even when the pie is pulled out, it's not going to run into the sentiment and impede that movement. So I've got my pie pulled all the way out, and I'm being really careful not to get even too close to it. And I will glue down the Thanksgiving and then the Hap-Pie. I don't know about you guys, but I love a pun. This is like a whole stamp set full of puns. There's also some pie stamps in there that you can color, and then there's coordinating dies. To attach this to my card base, I need to make room for that mechanism. You could use foam tape, but I had a bunch of scraps of cardstock These are about an inch thick, and I just added glue to a bunch of them and stacked them up. I like to pick them up all at the same time so I'm not constantly like repeating the same movement. I did 4 thick, but 3 thick would have worked just fine, right? My slider is double thick, that light blue piece, and I just need it to be a little thicker than that. I don't know why I did 4. You don't need 4. So I have these little pieces, again, just because that's the size scrap that I had, and I'm making a channel that slider will stay in. It wiggles a fair bit, and I don't want it to wiggle too much. There isn't a ton of cardstock holding that in there, right? And so I want to make sure it's protected. This is one of the ways I can do that. I'm just trimming down extra cardstock and gluing that all over the back. I'm making sure that periodically I'm moving that light blue piece so I know I haven't blocked it or created some sort of impediment to our slider. Then I'll add glue all over the back of that extra cardstock, not the slider. Don't put it on the blue piece. And I will center that onto my teal panel. I'm going to trim off the edge of this, but I'm going to tape it in place first just to make sure it doesn't wiggle while I'm using my scissors. And at this point, I thought I was done. But then I thought, what about whipped cream? I made some of these earlier when I was just playing around, and I'm like, all right, let's try it again. This is Cloud Whip. It is a modeling paste, but any sort of texture paste, modeling paste that will dry with dimension will probably work here. Cloud Whip is particularly dry on purpose so that you could add like a re-inker or a color to it. I am not adding color, but that means I need to add some water to thin it out. And you got to be really careful. The ones I made earlier, I think were too wet. So the whipped cream sort of sunk and was flat, like when you didn't whip it enough before you put it on your pie. I am just adding mine into the corner of a plastic baggie, like a Ziploc that I cut down to make it easier. And I will gently push that towards the corner and then kind of twist it like a piping bag. At one point in my life, I thought I loved decorating sugar cookies with royal icing until I realized how many dishes there were. But this just kind of brings me back to that. If anybody has decorated with royal icing, you know what I'm talking about. Leave me a comment. I am putting my piece of acetate right on top of my piece of pie, so I know how big of a dollop that I want on there. And I'm going to make as many as I have modeling paste for, so that when these dry, I can save them for later and put them on all kinds of pies, because you know I'm going to make a bunch of pies. These dried in a couple of hours, but I left them overnight because I got kids and I was busy. So I'm just going to peel it right off the acetate. They have a ton of dimension, but they are a little bit soft, okay? And so I'm adding a little bit of glue onto the bottom, feeling brave, putting it down with my left hand, got it just fine. And then finally, we have finished our card. It has all that dimension. You've got the pumpkin on the inside of the pie that just makes me so happy. Hap-Pie Thanksgiving. And then I have a bonus card for you. So I made this one with the tiny pie die. And a bunch of the pies are just how they were designed in that set, but I needed whipped cream. So I stole the frosting from the Trinity Cupcake shape card, and I just ran my pencil right along the debossed line on the left side and then sort of made a stopping place on the other side and cut it down. I used some gray markers right in those debossed details just to finish it off. My friends, I hope this has inspired you to make a whole bunch of pies, to step them up in some interesting ways. I know I sure had fun with it. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, and I will see you next time.